Hello, welcome back. So here we're continuing on our chapter 6 discussion. This little mini lesson is going to take a look at the details of compact and spongy bone anatomy. We will see this also in our lab discussions. They go hand in hand with what you're learning in lab. So let's just jump right in with the anatomy of compact bone. So compact bone, if you remember from our last video, it is found in the diaphysis. Right? It's found surrounding the diaphysis in the cortex of flat bones and all the way around. So compact bone is primarily going to be found in this diaphysis, and it runs parallel to the length of the bone. So we can see kind of this up and down orientation of these structures called osteons. They will be running in the same orientation of your long bone. Parallel is what we call that, okay? So then let's just kind of start going through our terms. So the major unit, functional unit, if you will, of compact bone is a term called the osteon. Sometimes it's called a Herversian system, which is kind of an older term. You don't need to know that. Osteons are a lot easier to spell than Herversian, but I just wanted to let you know that word is out there. So what is an osteon? Well, an osteon, here's kind of a close-up of one over here. In the middle of the osteon, there's a hollow tube called the central canal, which makes sense because it's in the center. In it, there are blood vessels, as we can see, a capillary and a venule. So arterial flow, which is bringing the oxygen, venule flow, which is taking away the carbon dioxide. It's also innervated. There's nerves in here. It's not shown in this picture, probably for clarity, but just know there will be nerves in that tube as well. So this is the blood supply. This is where all the bone cells are trying to do their exchange with the circulation. And then surrounding that central canal are layers of bone matrix. The word that we use for layer is lamellae, or lamella for one layer, lamellae for multiple layers. It just means layer. Okay, we saw that with the lamellated corpuscles in your skin, just many layers for that sensory neuron that was associated with deep pressure. So multiple layers of the matrix around the central canal, that makes up an osteon. And there's lots of different kinds of lamellae. There's actually three, I should say not lots, there's three types. This first type is called concentric lamellae. Concentric, like concentric circles like of a bullseye. So concentric is you have a small circle and then ever increasing circles. So those are called concentric lamellae because they're layers in ever increasing sizes of circles. So if I'm going to draw another osteon here, and then in between I might have some layers of other osteons. This is what we call interstitial lamellae. Interstitial lamellae, interstitial means in between. So interstitial lamellae, you can see, are layers of matrix that aren't quite in a pattern of an osteon. Okay? And then the last type of lamellae is what we call circumferential. Circumference means the outermost edge. So this is going to be found around the whole outside edge of your compact bone. Right? So that is your circumferential lamellae. We have a model just like this in lab that you'll get your chance to get hands on and see this in person. So those are three types of lamellae. And remember, lamellae just means layers. Okay, so lamellae are layers. And the layers, they're layers of what? They're layers of matrix. So it is that collagen fiber, calcium salts matrix that are formed in these layers, right? So here is one layer of matrix, a lamellae. And then sandwiched between the lamellae are going to be your osteocytes living in their lacuna. Right? So we'll see this on the next slide a little bit better. Okay. Where am I at? Okay, so osteon, central canal. Okay, so the central canals contain the blood supply that run parallel to the length of the bone. But where did that blood come from? Well, you have blood vessels outside of the bone here, large arteries and veins, and they have to penetrate through the matrix to reach those central canals. And these are what we call perforating canals. So the central canals go up and down, okay? Perforating canals go horizontal to the orientation of your long bone, right? So here's the femur. So my osteons are running in this orientation. The central canals are running in this orientation with the blood vessels. Perforating canals are going to be running horizontal to this orientation or perpendicular. So osteons and central canals are parallel to the bone. Perforating canals are perpendicular to the bone, perforating. They're perforating deep into that compact bone structure. Okay. All right. So I think that's about it that I wanted to cover here. We'll talk about the periosteum, perforating fibers, and endosteum on another slide at the end of this mini lesson. Okay, so that's compact bone structure. I think I covered everything there. So here's a very cool micrograph. You should be familiar with this. We saw bone structure in our histology in chapter 4, but now we can start adding a little bit more knowledge to this. So we can identify, I'll highlight one osteon, right? So there's an osteon. I'll kind of circle the osteons. Now I can also then start highlighting our interstitial lamellae, right? So the lamellae that doesn't quite fit into osteons. Right? So all of this stuff that I highlighted green would be your interstitial lamellae. And this picture doesn't have the circumferential lamellae. We have our central canals here within the osteon, and this is a really good example of a perforating canal because it's going perpendicular to the central canal that we're looking straight down in. And then I can also start identifying the lamellae, okay? All of these layers here. Those are the concentric lamellae. And then lastly, we can see the osteocytes, the little black specks I'm going to circle with purple. So the osteocytes are sandwiched between all of these layers of lamellae. And then what you can't really see, I mean, you can look closely. I'll kind of draw them up here. So you can see all of these little squiggly lines coming off of where the osteocytes live. Those are going to be the canaliculi, right? So the little canals that connect the cells to each other and eventually connect the cells to the central canal or the perforating canal. That's your blood supply, okay? So in this very cool micrograph, we can actually see quite a bit of the structures that we just saw on that drawing on the previous slide. Okay. So next we're going to take a look at spongy bone, and I don't have an example of spongy bone in my bones because it's all encased within the model here. We do have a good example of spongy bone in lab, so make sure you spend some time. It's a cow femur that you can actually touch and feel and take a look at the spongy bone. The difference between compact bone and spongy bone, clearly you can see compact bone is very dense. It's solid. And spongy bone isn't. So all of this air pockety looking stuff, it has a lot of open spaces in it. It's not soft like a sponge, but it looks like a sponge. That's where it gets its name. So all the little branches and what we call spicules of bone, this is got its own special name, which we call trabeculae. So trabeculae means branches. So in the spongy bone structure, they don't have osteons. They don't have all of those things we just looked at that's associated with compact bone. Spongy bone primarily just has trabeculae. And if we look, they have lamellae, so there's layers, but do we see a central canal inside of that trabeculae? No, there's no central canal. There's not a need for those central canals because if you take a look, all of the canaliculi from all of the cells in those little layers open up to the surface of the trabeculae. And what's hanging out in between all of the trabeculae, I'm going to scribble red bone marrow. So all of this is completely filled with red bone marrow. It's red because it's very vascular. It's very filled with blood. And so for all of the little cells here, all they have to do is connect to that space out here, because there's only a few layers of lamellae in a trabeculae. So they get to do it almost a direct connection with the blood supply. They're not limited to perforating canals and central canals like we see in compact bone. Okay, so that is our spongy bone structure made up of trabeculae. It's got a few layers of lamellae within each of the trabeculae. There's no central canals, no perforating canals, because it's completely surrounded by the red bone marrow, the very vascular bone marrow. I did want to highlight, let me see if I can find my highlighter. All of this outer stuff here, this is the cortex. It's compact bone that surrounds the spongy bone. It's a thin layer of compact bone because that's going to give these surfaces, they're smooth, right? You don't want spongy bone to be exposed. So there's a thin layer of compact bone over the spongy bone in the epiphyses of your long bone. See how smooth that is? Because that's where our joints are. We want those to be nice, smooth surfaces, not big, rough, and pokey spongy bone. All right, the last couple slides are going to be dealing with the linings of the bone. The first one is called the periosteum. So the periosteum is an outer lining. It covers the surfaces of the bone, right? So this whole bone would be covered by this connective tissue sheath called the periosteum. It has a couple layers to it. We have the fibrous layer. Oh, I'm still on highlighter. That's all right. We've got the fibrous layer, which is mostly collagen fibers. It's kind of like a dense, regular connective tissue. And then we have the cellular layer, which is primarily fibroblasts. There can be some fibroblasts to help maintain the collagen fibers of the fibrous layer, but you're also going to find osteoblasts, osteoclasts, and osteoprogenitors. So all of those other cells that we saw in the histology slides can be found in the cellular layer of the periosteum. Okay, so blasts, clasts, and genitor cells. Okay. The collagen fibers, get back to the pen here, the collagen fibers of the fibrous layer penetrate through the cellular layer and kind of embed themselves as part of the matrix of the bone. So it's very, very tightly held together. So it's like interwoven. So collagen fibers of the periosteum are interwoven with collagen fibers of the matrix. And so that periosteum is held very tightly to the surface of the bone. And these are called perforating fibers. Sometimes they're called Sharpie's fibers. So here I have some micrographs showing, here's the periosteum here. So we have the fibrous layer here, we have the cellular layer here, and then here's bone. So it's like a different perspective. It's a longitudinal cut. So these are all the lacuna with the little osteocytes inside. Okay. Down the bottom, here's your periosteum, the fibrous layer out here, the cellular layer here, and here is, without the obvious rings, there's an osteon with a central canal, and we have our layers of matrix with the osteocytes living in their lacuna. We can see that now, hopefully. Here would be the other one. Okay, and then some interstitial lamellae right here. Okay, so that is the periosteum, the outermost covering fibrous and cellular layers held very tightly with the perforating or Sharpie's fibers into that circumferential lamellae. Okay, and then the last lining is what's called the endosteum. It lines the inside of the cell. It's going to, inside of the bone, sorry. It's going to be lining the marrow cavity, right? So we can see that right here. It will be found lining the marrow cavity, but it also lines all of the central canals, perforating canals, and it covers all of the trabeculae around in your spongy bone. So endosteum is very prominent on the inner surfaces of the bone, the marrow cavity, all the trabeculae of the spongy bone, your central canals, and your perforating canals is lined by endosteum. Well, what is it? It's really just a collection of cells. It doesn't have collagen fibers like the periosteum does. It is just osteoblasts, osteoprogenitor cells, osteoclasts. That's about it. It's just these, all of those populations of cells scattered around on this inner lining of all these spaces, because that's where you're going to be doing a lot of changes. And so you need the bone makers, the bone breakers, and then the bone stem cells that can make those osteoblasts. Okay, so that wraps up this, this mini lesson. The next topic we're going to take a look at is ossifications. We have endochondral and intramembranous ossifications. All right, I'll see you next time. Bye.